The ancient castle stood like a black tooth against the crimson sky, its towers reaching into clouds that seemed to bleed eternal twilight. Within its stone walls, shadows danced with lives of their own, and the air hummed with power older than recorded history. This was the domain of Alexander Blackthorn, the vampire king who had ruled the supernatural underworld for over 8 centuries. Isabella Chen had been summoned to this place 3 nights ago. The message had arrived through channels she didn't know existed. A raven with eyes like liquid silver had perched on her apartment windowsill in downtown Seattle, carrying a scroll sealed with wax that bore the mark of the Blackthorn dynasty. The elegant script had been brief but commanding. Your presence is required. Come alone. Trust no one. She had been working as a forensic accountant for the FBI, specializing in cases that others couldn't solve. Her reputation for uncovering hidden truths had apparently reached ears in places she never imagined. What she hadn't known was that many of her most successful cases had involved supernatural entities laundering money through human enterprises. The vampire community had been watching her for months. Now she stood in the great hall of Shadowmere Castle, her breath visible in small puffs despite it being mid-July. The stone floor beneath her feet was polished obsidian that reflected torchlight like trapped starlight. Tapestries depicting battles between creatures of myth hung from walls that rose 40 feet to a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Alexander emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of centuries spent commanding others. His hair was black as midnight, pulled back from a face that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. But it was his eyes that held her, pale gray like winter storms, ancient and knowing, yet somehow sad in a way that made her chest tighten. He wore a simple black shirt and dark trousers, no crown or obvious symbols of authority, yet power radiated from him like heat from a forge. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. Isabella had interviewed serial killers who had made her skin crawl, but Alexander made her feel something entirely different, a strange mixture of fear and fascination that she couldn't explain. Isabella Chen, he said, and his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth with an underlying burn. Age 28, graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with degrees in mathematics and criminal justice. Worked for Goldman Sachs for 2 years before joining the FBI. Parents emigrated from Taiwan when you were 3. You speak 4 languages fluently and have an eidetic memory for numbers. He paused, studying her with those storm gray eyes. You also have no idea why you're here. I have some theories, Isabella replied, proud that her voice remained steady. Based on the cases I've worked, I'd say you're involved in financial activities that have caught federal attention. The question is whether you're going to try to bribe me, threaten me, or kill me. Alexander's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Direct. I appreciate that. He began walking toward her, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. But your theories don't go far enough. Tell me, in all your investigations, have you ever wondered why certain individuals seem to have unlimited resources, why some financial patterns span decades or even centuries, why certain names appear in records going back to the founding of this country? There were patterns in the data that defied explanation, wealth that seemed to regenerate itself, investment strategies that demonstrated knowledge no human could possess. She'd written reports about it, but her superiors had always redirected her to more conventional explanations. Money laundering operations run by organized crime, she said. Generational wealth maintained by families with good lawyers and offshore accounts. Practical answers for a practical mind, Alexander said, now only a few feet away from her. But what if I told you that some of us have had centuries to perfect the art of accumulating wealth? What if I told you that the supernatural world has its own economy, its own needs, its own methods of maintaining power? Instead, she saw something that chilled her. Absolute sincerity. I'd say you're either delusional or you're telling me you're not human. His skin was pale, almost luminescent in the torchlight, and she could see dark veins beneath the surface. But what made her step back was the complete absence of warmth radiating from him as if he were made of beautiful, animate stone. "I am Alexander Blackthorne," he said formally. "I was born in the year 1187 in what is now Romania. I was turned into a vampire in 1214 by a creature whose name has been lost to history. I have ruled the supernatural communities of the Pacific Northwest for the past 4 centuries, and I control financial assets worth approximately $47 billion. The rational part of Isabella's mind rejected what she was hearing. Vampires were fiction, stories told to frighten children and sell movie tickets, but her analytical side was cataloging details that supported his claim: his unnatural stillness, the way shadows seemed to bend toward him, the fact that she couldn't hear him breathing, the subtle wrongness of his scent, like old books and winter air instead of cologne or sweat. "Prove it," she said. Alexander's smile revealed teeth that were perfectly white and razor-sharp. In the space of a heartbeat, he moved from standing in front of her to behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She hadn't seen him move. One moment he was there, the next he was touching her, and the cold of his skin seeped through her jacket. "Proof enough?" he asked, his voice a whisper against her ear. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to turn around and meet his gaze. "Impressive parlor trick. What do you want from me?" "Your expertise," Alexander said, moving back to give her space, "and eventually perhaps your loyalty." He gestured toward a side door she hadn't noticed before. "Come, let me show you why you're here." Isabella followed him through corridors lined with portraits of people dressed in clothing from different eras. Some of the faces looked familiar, and she realized with a start that she was seeing the same individuals painted across centuries. Alexander himself appeared in frames dating from the 1400s to what looked like the 1990s, his face unchanged by time. They entered a room that looked like something between a library and a command center. The walls were lined with books that appeared to be bound in leather and metal, while the center of the space was dominated by a massive table covered with financial documents, computer printouts, and what looked like intelligence reports. Several high-end computers hummed quietly on desks around the perimeter. "Welcome to the heart of my operation," Alexander said. "From this room, I manage the financial affairs of approximately 3,000 supernatural beings across North America. Vampires, werewolves, witches, fae folk, and others you haven't dreamed of. Each one needs documentation, bank accounts, investment strategies, and protection from human authorities who wouldn't understand their true nature." Isabella moved to the table and began examining the documents. What she saw made her professionally trained mind reel. There were investment portfolios that showed consistent returns over periods of 60 or 70 years, real estate holdings that had been maintained by the same families since the 1800s, and business partnerships that should have been impossible given the lifespans of the supposed human participants. "This is incredible," she murmured, running calculations in her head. "The compound interest alone on some of these investments, you could fund small countries." "We have," Alexander said dryly. "Several of them, in fact." She looked up at him. "Why show me this? Why trust a human with information that could destroy everything you've built?" Alexander moved to stand across the table from her, his hands resting on the surface among the papers. "Because it's already being destroyed. Someone has been systematically attacking our financial networks for the past 18 months. They know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, which suggests they understand our operations intimately. They've cost us nearly $2 billion so far, and more importantly, they've exposed several of our people to human authorities." Isabella studied the papers more closely, her analytical mind automatically beginning to trace patterns in the data. "You think it's someone on the inside?" "I know it is," Alexander said grimly. "The attacks are too precise, too well-timed. Whoever is doing this has access to our most closely guarded financial records. They know our vulnerabilities because they helped create our defenses. And you want me to find them. I want you to join us." Isabella looked up sharply. "Excuse me? You spent your career following money trails that others couldn't see, finding connections that others missed. You have a gift for understanding how complex financial systems work, and more importantly, how they can be manipulated. We need someone with your skills permanently. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a place in a world that most humans never know exists, Alexander said. The supernatural community needs someone who can modernize our financial systems, make them more secure, more efficient. You would have resources at your disposal that the FBI could never provide. The ability to investigate crimes and mysteries that span centuries. And, he paused, studying her face. The truth about things you've been wondering about your entire career. She had always been drawn to puzzles, to mysteries that others couldn't solve. The idea of investigating supernatural crimes, of having access to information that spanned centuries of human history, was intoxicating. But she was also practical. The supernatural world has its own rules, its own justice system. Once you're part of it, you can never truly leave. And there are dangers here that you can't imagine. The person who's been attacking us has killed 3 of our people already, not just murdered them, but destroyed them in ways that ensure they can never return.
Killed vampires? Isabella asked. Among others.
Whoever we're dealing with knows exactly how to eliminate different types of supernatural beings permanently. That suggests someone with extensive knowledge of our weaknesses. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, studying the financial documents scattered across the table. The rational part of her mind was screaming that she should run, should report back to her superiors, should stick to the safe, predictable world of human crime. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to impossible puzzles, was already hooked. "If I agree to help you," she said slowly, "I want full access to all your financial records. No restrictions, no classified information I can't see." "Agreed. I want protection. If this person has killed 3 of your people, they won't hesitate to kill me." "You'll have the full resources of my security force," Alexander promised, "and I want the truth about everything. No lies, no half-truths designed to protect my delicate human sensibilities." Alexander studied her face for a long moment. "Some truths are dangerous, Isabella. Some knowledge comes with a price." She replied, "I want to know what I'm paying for." Alexander nodded slowly. "Very well, but understand this. Once you know the full truth about our world, you'll be forever changed. You'll see things differently, understand connections that were invisible before. You may find that your old life no longer fits. Maybe that's what I need," Isabella said, surprising herself with the admission. Alexander extended his hand toward her. "Then welcome to the supernatural world, Isabella Chen. Try not to let it destroy you." As she shook his cold hand, Isabella felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with his unnatural temperature. She was stepping across a threshold she could never uncross, entering a world where the rules she'd lived by no longer applied. "Now," Alexander said, releasing her hand, "let me show you what we're really dealing with." He led her to one of the computers and pulled up a series of financial reports. The attacks began 18 months ago with small withdrawals from accounts belonging to younger vampires, amounts small enough that they might be overlooked or attributed to routine expenses. But over time, the attacks became bolder. Isabella studied the data, her mind automatically cataloging patterns.
"The amounts aren't random,"
she said after a few minutes. "There's a mathematical progression here. Each attack is designed to cause maximum disruption while maintaining plausible deniability." "Exactly. And look at the timing." Isabella traced the dates with her finger. Full moons, new moons, solar eclipses. She looked up at Alexander, someone who understands supernatural cycles. "The most recent attack was 3 days ago," Alexander continued. "They drained 17 accounts belonging to a werewolf pack in Montana. Not only did they steal approximately $30 million, but they also exposed the pack to human authorities. The FBI is now investigating what appears to be a complex money laundering operation." Isabella winced. "If the FBI gets too close, they'll discover that the family running the operation has members who appear to be the same age in photographs taken 50 years apart," Alexander finished. "It would be problematic." "Problematic is putting it mildly," Isabella muttered. "What happened to the 3 people who were killed?" "Marcus Thorne was a vampire who managed our West Coast real estate holdings. He was found in his office 3 weeks ago, burned to ash in a circle of salt and herbs, a method that ensures a vampire cannot regenerate. Sarah Moonwhisper was a witch who handled our mystical investments. She was discovered in her home with her throat torn out by silver claws, surrounded by protective wards that had been turned inside out. And James Running Bear was a werewolf who oversaw our mining operations. He was found during the new moon, shot with silver bullets, and left where the pack would find him. Isabella felt sick. Each one killed in a way specific to their supernatural nature, someone who knows exactly how to kill each type of being permanently, Alexander confirmed. And in each case, the killer had access to information that should have been impossible for an outsider to obtain. Isabella studied the financial records more closely, looking for connections. The timing of the deaths correlates with major financial movements, she observed. Each person was killed just before they would have discovered irregularities in their sectors, which confirms that we're dealing with someone who has intimate knowledge of our operations, Alexander said. Someone who knew exactly when to strike to prevent discovery. How many people have access to this level of information? Fewer than 20, including myself. Alexander replied, "My inner circle consists of advisors who have been with me for decades, in some cases centuries." The idea that one of them could be betraying us, Isabella heard the pain in his voice and realized that this wasn't just about money or security for him. These weren't just employees or business partners. They were his family, his chosen clan. The betrayal cut deep. "I'll need to interview each of them," she said. Alexander nodded. "I've arranged for you to meet with them over the next few days. But Isabella," he paused, meeting her eyes, "you should know that some of them won't be pleased about bringing a human into our affairs. There will be resistance, possibly hostility. Dad lives another. I can handle hostility," Isabella said. "What I can't handle is being lied to or having information withheld. If you want me to find your traitor, I need complete honesty from everyone involved. Though you may find that supernatural honesty is different from human honesty, we've had centuries to perfect the art of selective truth-telling." Isabella smiled grimly. "Good thing I've had years of practice detecting selective truth-telling." Alexander returned her smile, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked almost human. "I think you're going to fit in better than either of us expected." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. Isabella's hand instinctively moved toward the gun holstered beneath her jacket before she realized that the newcomer had made no threatening moves. The woman approaching them was perhaps the most beautiful person Isabella had ever seen. She was tall and willowy, with skin like polished ebony and hair that fell in silver waves to her waist. Her eyes were the color of amethysts, and she moved with a grace that made Alexander's fluid movement seem clumsy by comparison. "Alexander," the woman said, and her voice was like music played on crystal bells, "you didn't tell me our guest had arrived. She's my oldest advisor and closest friend. Lydia, this is Isabella Chen, the financial investigator I told you about." Lydia glided closer, and Isabella noticed that her feet seemed to barely touch the ground. When she extended her hand in greeting, her skin was warm, warmer than human normal, like touching sun-baked stone. "Miss Chen," Lydia said, studying Isabella with those remarkable purple eyes, "Alexander has told us much about your reputation. I hope you understand what you're walking into." There was something in Lydia's tone that made Isabella straighten. "I'm beginning to," she replied carefully. Lydia smiled, revealing teeth that were perfectly normal. No fangs, no supernatural features at all except for her otherworldly beauty. "Good. Because the person we're hunting isn't just stealing money or even just killing our people. They're trying to start a war between the supernatural and human worlds. If they succeed, millions will die." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's temperature. A war? The supernatural community has worked for centuries to maintain secrecy, to coexist with humanity without revealing our true nature. But if our financial networks are exposed, if human authorities begin investigating us seriously, that balance will collapse. Some of our kind will want to eliminate the human threat entirely rather than risk exposure. And others will want to reveal ourselves completely, To stop hiding and take our place as the dominant species on Earth, Lydia added. Either path leads to conflict on a scale that this world has never seen. Isabella absorbed this information, her analytical mind racing through the implications. So finding this traitor isn't just about stopping financial theft. It's about preventing a supernatural war. Now you understand why we need someone with your particular skills, Alexander said. The future of both our worlds may depend on what you can uncover. Isabella looked around the room, taking in the ancient books, the modern computers, the financial records that represented centuries of careful planning and accumulated wealth. She thought about her old life, her apartment in Seattle, her FBI cases, her predictable routine of investigating human criminals who stole human money for human reasons. That life suddenly seemed impossibly small. "When do I start?" she asked. Alexander's smile was both relieved and predatory. "You already have." As if on cue, an alarm began sounding somewhere deep in the castle. Not a modern electronic alarm, but something that sounded like a horn carved from bone and blown by inhuman lungs. The sound made Isabella's teeth ache and her vision blur momentarily. "What is that?" she asked. Alexander and Lydia had both gone completely still, their expressions transforming into something inhuman and dangerous. Alexander's eyes had taken on a silver gleam, while Lydia's amethyst gaze had begun to glow with inner fire. "Someone is trying to breach our defenses," Alexander said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Isabella's bones. "The castle is under attack." Lydia was already moving toward a wall that had seemed solid stone but was apparently concealing some kind of weapons cache. She withdrew what looked like a sword made of crystallized starlight and a bow that seemed to be carved from a single piece of midnight black wood. "Who would dare attack Shadowmere directly?" Isabella asked. Alexander was moving toward another hidden panel, withdrawing weapons of his own, twin blades that seemed to be forged from silver and shadow. "Only someone who believes they have nothing left to lose," he replied, "or someone who knows exactly how our defenses work." The implication hit Isabella like a physical blow. "The traitor?" "It would appear," Alexander said grimly, "that our enemy has decided to make the first move." The bone-deep alarm continued to sound, and Isabella could hear something else now, sounds of battle echoing from somewhere in the castle's depths. Inhuman roars, the clash of supernatural weapons, and underneath it all, a sound like reality itself being torn apart. "What do I do?" Isabella asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Alexander turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw 8 centuries of leadership, of making impossible decisions in the face of supernatural threats. "You survive," he said simply, "and you remember everything you see tonight. Because if we don't make it through this, you may be the only one who can warn both worlds about what's coming." As the sounds of battle grew closer, Isabella realized that her new life in the supernatural world was about to begin with a trial by fire, quite literally, judging by the orange glow that had begun to flicker at the edges of her vision. Whatever was attacking Shadowmere Castle had brought more than weapons. They had brought supernatural fire, the kind that could burn through vampire flesh and stone with equal ease. Isabella Chen, forensic accountant and newly recruited supernatural investigator, was about to discover just how dangerous her new world could be. The battle for Shadowmere. The supernatural fire that blazed through Shadowmere Castle was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. It didn't consume the ancient stone walls. Instead, it seemed to seep into them, turning the very foundations of the castle into a source of heat and light that made the air shimmer like a mirage. The flames danced in colors that shouldn't have existed. Silver that burned like liquid moonlight, purple that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying heart, and green that whispered secrets in languages Isabella didn't recognize. Alexander moved through the burning corridors with lethal grace, his twin blades weaving patterns in the air that seemed to cut through the supernatural flames themselves. Isabella followed close behind him, one hand pressed to the wall for guidance as the heat distorted her vision, the other clutching the silver dagger that Lydia had pressed into her palm before disappearing into the shadows to coordinate the castle's defenses. "Stay close," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying easily over the roar of battle. The fire is meant to confuse and disorient. Don't trust what you see until we're clear of it. Isabella nodded, trying to process the impossibility of everything around her. Through the wavering flames, she caught glimpses of the attackers, figures that moved wrong, their limbs bending at angles that hurt to look at, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed to be carved from human bone. They wielded weapons that Isabella couldn't quite focus on. Every time she tried to look directly at them, her eyes slid away as if her brain refused to process what it was seeing. "What are they?" she gasped, stumbling as a wave of heat washed over them. "Revenants," Alexander replied grimly, decapitating one of the bone-masked figures with a single fluid motion. The creature dissolved into smoke and ash, but Isabella could see more of them moving through the flames, the animated dead given purpose and power by someone with considerable necromantic ability. A revenant emerged from a wall of silver fire directly in front of them, its impossible weapon raised to strike. Alexander moved to intercept it, but Isabella saw another one approaching from his blind spot. Without thinking, she lunged forward with the silver dagger Lydia had given her. The blade slid into the revenant's back with surprising ease, and the creature let out a shriek that sounded like breaking glass mixed with a dying scream. It turned toward her, and Isabella found herself staring into eye sockets that held swirling galaxies of cold starlight. "Impossible," the revenant hissed, its voice like sandpaper across marble. "A human cannot touch the silver blade of the Night Court." Isabella twisted the dagger, and the creature dissolved into ash that sparkled with residual magic. She stood there, shaking, staring at the silver dagger in her hand. The metal was warm now, and she could feel it humming with some kind of energy that seemed to resonate with her heartbeat. Alexander had dispatched his own attacker and turned to stare at her with an expression of complete shock. "That shouldn't have been possible," he said, echoing the revenant's words. "What shouldn't have been possible?" Isabella asked. But before Alexander could answer, Lydia materialized beside them, as if she had stepped out of the flames themselves. "The outer defenses are holding, but barely," Lydia reported. "Whoever is controlling these revenants knows exactly where our weak points are. They're attacking the foundation stones that anchor our protective wards." "How many?" Alexander asked. "At least 50 revenants, plus something else," Lydia replied. "Something that's staying hidden while the revenants do the initial damage. Marcus is coordinating the defense of the vault levels, and Sarah has the younger vampires secured in the deep sanctuaries." Isabella blinked in confusion. "Wait, I thought Marcus and Sarah were dead." Alexander and Lydia exchanged a look that Isabella couldn't interpret. "We needed you to believe they were dead," Alexander said quietly. "It was the only way to test whether the information about their deaths would leak to our enemy. You lied to me?" Isabella felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You made me think people had been murdered to test whether I could be trusted?" "No," Lydia said sharply. "We lied to everyone except our most trusted inner circle. If the enemy knew that Marcus, Sarah, and James were still alive, they would have been murdered for real. The fake deaths were the only way to protect them." "Then who was killed?" Isabella demanded. 3 of our enemies," Alexander replied, "supernatural beings who had been working against us for years. We made their deaths look like attacks on our people to flush out the real traitor." Isabella struggled to process this information while supernatural fire continued to rage around them. "So this was all a trap?" "A trap that's working better than we expected," Alexander said grimly. "The person behind these attacks has revealed themselves by launching this assault. They wouldn't risk exposing themselves unless they believed we were vulnerable." A howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that made Isabella's bones ache and her vision blur. The supernatural fire around them suddenly blazed brighter, and she could see new figures moving through the flames. These weren't revenants, they were something else entirely. "Hellhounds," Lydia whispered, her beautiful face pale with fear. "Someone has opened a rift to the shadow realm." The creatures that emerged from the flames were the size of horses, with bodies that seemed to be made of liquid shadow held together by malevolent will. Their eyes burned with the same impossible fire that consumed the castle, and when they moved, reality bent around them like heated glass. Alexander raised his twin blades, but Isabella could see the concern in his expression. Hellhounds require a master, he said, someone powerful enough to control them and direct their hunt. As if summoned by his words, a figure stepped through the wall of silver fire at the end of the corridor. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the newcomer. It was Dr. Elena Vasquez, the FBI's chief financial crimes investigator, Isabella's own mentor and the woman who had recommended her for this assignment. Dr. Vasquez looked exactly as Isabella remembered her, a tall, elegant woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore her usual professional attire, a navy blue suit with sensible shoes and minimal jewelry. She looked completely human, completely normal, completely wrong in this place of supernatural fire and impossible creatures. "Hello, Isabella," Dr. Vasquez said, her familiar voice cutting through the chaos of battle. "I'm sorry you had to be involved in this, but you've always been too curious for your own good." Isabella stared at her mentor in shock. "Elena, what are you doing here? How are you here?" Vasquez smiled the same warm, maternal smile that had encouraged Isabella through countless difficult cases. "I've been watching over the supernatural community's financial affairs for the FBI for over 20 years, she said. Making sure they stayed hidden, keeping human authorities from looking too closely at their activities. It was a good arrangement for everyone involved." "Was?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Things change, Doctor," Vasquez replied, and now Isabella could see something cold and alien in her mentor's familiar eyes. The supernatural community has grown too powerful, accumulated too much wealth and influence. Left unchecked, you'll eventually dominate human civilization entirely. That can't be allowed to happen. One of the hellhounds padded closer to Dr. Vasquez, and Isabella watched in horror as her mentor casually rested her hand on the creature's shadowy head. The contact should have burned her, should have killed her instantly, but instead the hellhound leaned into her touch like a faithful dog. "You're not human," Isabella whispered. "I'm something far older than human," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "I was already ancient when the first vampires learned to walk upright. I've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen species evolve and go extinct. Humans are still young, still full of potential. I won't let parasitic creatures like vampires and werewolves drain that potential away." Alexander stepped forward, his blades gleaming in the supernatural firelight. "You're a primordial. I should have sensed it." "You should have, Dr. Brady." Vasquez agreed. "But I've had millennia to perfect the art of hiding what I am, even from creatures as perceptive as vampire kings." Isabella felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her mentor, about her career, about the case that had brought her here, was crumbling. "You sent me here," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You recommended me for this assignment." "I needed someone inside Alexander's inner circle," Dr. Vasquez confirmed. "Someone he would trust, someone who could give me access to the financial records I needed to bring down their entire operation. You were perfect, brilliant, dedicated, and completely unaware of the supernatural world." "But I didn't give you anything," Isabella protested. "I've only been here for a few hours." Vasquez smiled again, but now the expression held no warmth at all. "My dear Isabella, you've been giving me information for months. Every case you worked that involved supernatural finances, every report you filed, every pattern you identified, it all came across my desk. You've been helping me map their entire financial network without even knowing it." Isabella felt sick. All her successful cases, all the patterns she'd uncovered, all the financial irregularities she'd traced, she'd been helping her mentor destroy the very community she'd just agreed to join. "The attacks on the financial accounts," she said slowly. "You were testing your intelligence, making sure your information was accurate," Vasquez praised. "Each attack was designed to verify what you discovered and probe for additional weaknesses. The fake deaths were an unexpected complication, but they actually helped confirm which financial sectors were most vulnerable." Alexander's grip on his weapons tightened. "And now you're here to finish what you started." "I'm here to end a threat to human civilization." Dr. Vasquez corrected. The supernatural community has become too powerful, too wealthy, too influential. You control major corporations, manipulate government policies, influence elections. Left unchecked, you'll reduce humanity to cattle. We've coexisted peacefully for centuries, Lydia interjected. Peacefully? Dr. Vasquez laughed, and the sound made the hellhounds growl in harmony. You feed on human blood, human fear, human life force. You manipulate human emotions and memories. You treat mortals as resources to be harvested. That's not coexistence. That's predation. Isabella found herself caught between two worldviews that seemed equally valid and equally terrifying. The supernatural community did seem to see humans as lesser beings, resources to be managed and controlled. But Dr. Vasquez's solution, apparently the complete destruction of supernatural beings, seemed equally extreme. What about me? Isabella asked. I'm human. If you're trying to protect humanity, why are you willing to kill me? Dr. Vasquez's expression softened with what looked like genuine regret. Because you've been contaminated, dear. You've seen too much, learned too much. You can use supernatural weapons now. I saw you kill that revenant with Lydia's silver dagger. That's impossible for a normal human. Whatever they've done to you, it's changed you on a fundamental level. Isabella looked down at the silver dagger in her hand. It was still warm, still humming with that strange energy that seemed connected to her pulse. I don't feel different, Vasquez said. Given time, exposure to the supernatural world transforms humans in unpredictable ways. Some become supernatural beings themselves. Others develop abilities that make them dangerous to their own species. Either way, you're no longer fully human. Alexander moved closer to Isabella, positioning himself between her and the hellhounds. Even if that were true, it doesn't give you the right to decide who lives and who dies, doesn't it? Dr. Vasquez asked. I've been protecting this world for over 10,000 years. I've prevented wars, stopped plagues, eliminated threats that would have destroyed entire civilizations. The supernatural community has become one of those threats. The supernatural fire around them suddenly flared brighter, and Isabella realized that their conversation had been taking place while battle continued to rage throughout the castle. She could hear the sounds of combat echoing from other parts of the building, the roars and screams of creatures fighting and dying. Your people are losing, Doctor, Vasquez said, as if reading Isabella's thoughts. My revenants are systematically destroying the ward stones that protect this castle. Once the defenses fall completely, the hellhounds will be able to hunt freely. Every supernatural being in Shadowmere will be dead within the hour. Unless, Alexander asked, unless you surrender yourselves and agree to the complete dissolution of your financial networks. Dr. Vasquez replied, transfer all assets to human institutions, abandon your hidden influence over human governments and corporations, and submit to permanent exile from human-populated areas. Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You're asking us to give up everything we've built over centuries and accept banishment to wilderness areas where we'll slowly starve or go mad from isolation. I'm offering you the chance to live, Dr. Vasquez corrected, which is more mercy than your kind has ever shown to humans who discovered your true nature. Isabella's mind was racing through everything she'd learned, trying to find some solution that didn't end in mass murder. There has to be another way, she said, some kind of compromise that protects both communities. Vasquez shook her head sadly. You still don't understand, Isabella. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't about finding a compromise. This is about preventing the supernatural community from becoming powerful enough to enslave humanity entirely. And if you're wrong, Isabella demanded, if they really can coexist peacefully, if destroying them means eliminating knowledge and abilities that could benefit both species, then I'll accept responsibility for that mistake, Dr. Vasquez replied. But I won't risk the future of human civilization on the hope that predators will choose to limit their own power. Alexander stepped forward, his twin blades reflecting the supernatural fire. This conversation is over. If you want to destroy us, you'll have to do it by force. Dr. Vasquez nodded, as if she'd expected this response. So be it. She gestured to the hellhounds, and they began stalking forward, their shadow forms rippling with malevolent energy. Isabella found herself moving without conscious decision, positioning herself beside Alexander with the silver dagger raised. She had no training in supernatural combat, no idea how to fight creatures made of living shadow, but she couldn't stand by and watch her former mentor, murder people who had trusted her. "Isabella, stay back," Alexander commanded. "Hellhounds are beyond mortal weapons." "This isn't a mortal weapon anymore," Isabella replied, and she was right. The silver dagger in her hand had begun glowing with its own inner light, and she could feel power flowing through it into her body. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. The first hellhound leaped toward them, its form stretching and distorting as it moved through the supernatural fire. Alexander met its attack with his twin blades, but the creature's shadow body flowed around his weapons like liquid darkness. Isabella didn't think. She simply moved. The silver dagger in her hand seemed to know where to strike, guiding her arm in movements that felt both natural and impossible. The blade slid into the hellhound's form, and the creature let out a howl that shattered 3 of the ancient windows. But instead of dissolving like the revenant had, the hellhound grabbed Isabella's wrist with what felt like a hand made of frozen fire. Pain shot up her arm, and she could see frost spreading across her skin from the point of contact. "Hellhounds drain the life force of their victims," Lydia explained, even as she engaged another of the creatures with her crystal sword. "It will kill you in seconds." But the silver dagger was still glowing, still humming with that strange energy, and she realized that the weapon was somehow drawing power from her even as the hellhound drained it away. "I'm not dying that easily," she gasped, and drove the dagger deeper into the creature's shadowy form. The hellhound's grip on her wrist tightened, but now Isabella could feel something flowing both ways through their connection. The creature was draining her life force, but she was also drawing something from it. Knowledge, memories, understanding of its true nature. Through the connection, she saw Dr. Vasquez as the hellhound saw her. Not a human woman, but something ancient and terrible, a being of such immense power that reality warped around her simply by existing. She had been telling the truth about being older than civilization, but she had been lying about her motivations. Dr. Vasquez didn't want to protect humanity from supernatural predators. She wanted to eliminate potential rivals for power over the human world. She had been subtly manipulating human development for millennia, guiding civilization along paths that served her purposes, and the supernatural community's growing influence threatened her control. "You're not protecting humans," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the burning corridor despite the ongoing battle. "You're protecting your own power over them." Vasquez's composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something inhuman and hungry underneath. "Clever girl, but it doesn't matter what you've discovered. You'll be dead in moments, and your revelation dies with you." But Isabella wasn't dying. Instead, she could feel the silver dagger drawing more and more power from the hellhound, and through it, Vasquez herself. The weapon had become a conduit, allowing Isabella to tap into the same primordial energies that Dr. Vasquez commanded. The dagger, Isabella said, understanding flooding through her. "It's not just a weapon. It's a key." Lydia looked over from her own battle, her amethyst eyes wide with sudden comprehension. The silver blade of the Night Court. It was forged to allow mortals to channel supernatural power safely. Alexander decapitated the hellhound he'd been fighting and turned to stare at Isabella. "Those blades were lost centuries ago. How did you?" "I've had it for over 1,000 years," Lydia admitted, waiting for someone who could use it properly. Vasquez's control over her expression had slipped completely now, revealing the ancient alien intelligence beneath her human disguise. Impossible. The Night Court fell before the first human cities were built. Their weapons were destroyed. Hidden, not destroyed, Lydia corrected, along with their knowledge of how to bind primordial entities to protect mortal realms. Isabella felt power coursing through her body, changing her on levels she couldn't understand. But with the power came knowledge, understanding of what the silver dagger truly was and what she could do with it. The Night Court was a partnership between mortals and supernatural beings, she said, the words coming from knowledge she didn't remember acquiring. They created weapons and bindings designed to protect both communities from entities like you. Dr. Vasquez raised her hand, and Isabella could see power gathering around her fingers, power that could unmake reality itself. Enough. I won't be bound by ancient treaties or forgotten magic. But Isabella was already moving, the silver dagger tracing patterns in the air that seemed to cut through space itself. Words and languages she'd never learned flowed from her lips, and she could feel the supernatural fire around them responding to her commands. By the compact made in shadow and starlight, Isabella intoned, by the binding wrought in silver and will, I call upon the ancient laws that protect both mortal and immortal realms. Dr. Vasquez's attack struck an invisible barrier inches from Isabella's face and dissipated like smoke. The primordial being's eyes widened in shock and something that might have been fear. The binding holds, Isabella continued, power flowing through her voice. The compact is intact. The Night Court's protection endures. The hellhounds suddenly turned on Dr. Vasquez, their shadow forms wavering as the magical bonds that controlled them shifted. The revenants throughout the castle let out collective shrieks as their animating power was severed. Dr. Sage, Vasquez staggered backward, her human disguise flickering like a broken television signal. This isn't possible. I destroyed the Night Court. I scattered their power to the winds. You destroyed the people, Isabella said, advancing with the glowing silver dagger. But power like that doesn't die. It waits for someone worthy to claim it. Alexander and Lydia fell into step beside her, their own weapons raised. But Isabella could see in their expressions that they knew this wasn't their battle anymore. This was between her and the ancient entity that had been masquerading as her mentor. What do you want, Dr. Ebb? Vasquez asked, her voice losing its human warmth and taking on harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. I want the truth, Isabella replied, all of it, and I want you to leave both communities alone. And if I refuse? Isabella smiled, and she could feel the Night Court's power blazing behind her eyes. Then I'll do what the Night Court was created to do, bind you to protect the realms you've been manipulating. Dr. Vasquez studied her for a long moment, then began to laugh. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with the death screams of stars, and it made everyone in the corridor stagger. You have no idea what you're playing with, Dr. Vasquez said. The power you've claimed comes with a price you haven't even begun to understand. What price? Isabella asked, though she was already beginning to suspect. The Night Court's champions were never fully human, Dr. Vasquez explained. The power changes you, transforms you into something that can stand against primordial forces. You will live for millennia, watching everyone you care about grow old and die. You'll see civilizations rise and fall, wars fought and won and forgotten, and eventually you'll understand why I do what I do. Because someone has to make the hard choices to protect the world, even when those choices seem monstrous. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hellhound's touch. The knowledge flowing through the silver dagger confirmed what Dr. Vasquez was saying. The power she'd claimed would indeed transform her, make her into something between human and supernatural being. But looking at Alexander and Lydia, at the castle around them, at the evidence of centuries of supernatural beings and humans coexisting in secret, she realized that she was willing to pay that price. Maybe you're right, Isabella said. Maybe I'll become something like you eventually. But right now, I'm choosing to protect both communities instead of playing them against each other. Dr. Vasquez's form began to waver, her human disguise finally failing entirely. What stood in her place was difficult to look at directly. A being of shifting geometries and impossible angles, power-given form and malevolent purpose. So be it, the entity said in a voice like the end of worlds. But remember that I offered you a choice. What comes next is on your head. The primordial being that had been Dr. Vasquez dissolved into mist and shadow, flowing through the castle walls and dissipating into nothingness. The supernatural fire began to die down, the hellhounds faded away like smoke, and the sounds of battle throughout the castle gradually ceased. Isabella stood in the sudden quiet, the silver dagger still glowing in her hand, and tried to process everything that had happened. She had uncovered a conspiracy that spanned millennia, discovered that her mentor was an ancient entity manipulating both human and supernatural civilizations, and somehow claimed the power of a long-lost magical court. "Is it over?" she asked. Alexander shook his head. "This was just the beginning. She'll be back, probably with allies and a better plan. And now that you've claimed the Night Court's power, you'll be a target for every entity that wants to challenge the old compacts." "But we have time to prepare," Lydia added. "Time to rebuild our defenses, strengthen our alliances, and figure out how to use your new abilities."
Isabella looked down at the silver dagger, which was slowly returning to its normal appearance.
She could still feel the power thrumming through it, waiting to be called upon, but the overwhelming rush of supernatural knowledge was fading to manageable levels. "What happens now?" she asked. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, the expression looked genuinely warm. "Now we rebuild. We strengthen the bonds between supernatural communities, improve our security measures, and prepare for the next threat. And we figure out how to integrate the Night Court's knowledge with our modern operations. Plus," Lydia added with a grin that revealed her own fangs, "we teach you how to use that dagger properly. What you did here tonight was impressive, but it was also extremely dangerous. Without proper training, that much power could have killed you." Isabella nodded, then paused as a thought occurred to her. "The financial investigation, was any of that real, or was I just being manipulated from the beginning?" "The supernatural community's financial networks are real," Alexander assured her, "and we do need someone with your skills to modernize and secure them. Doc Vasquez may have engineered your recruitment, but the job itself is entirely legitimate." "Good," Isabella said. "Because after tonight, I think I'm going to need the distraction of hunting through financial records and tracking money trails. It seems peaceful compared to fighting primordial entities and binding ancient powers." Alexander and Lydia exchanged amused glances. "Just wait until you meet the rest of the supernatural financial community," Lydia said. "Dragon hordes, fairy gold, demon contracts. It makes human money laundering look straightforward." Isabella laughed, surprising herself. Despite everything that had happened, despite the power now flowing through her veins and the knowledge that her life would never be the same, she felt oddly at peace with her choice. "Well," she said, tucking the silver dagger into her jacket, "I always did like a challenge." As they walked through the cooling corridors of Shadowmere Castle, past walls scorched by supernatural fire and windows shattered by otherworldly combat, Isabella realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a purpose that was bigger than herself, a community that needed her unique skills and the kind of mystery that would take lifetimes to fully understand. The human part of her life was over. Whatever she was becoming would be shaped by the choices she made in the days and years to come. But for the first time in her life, Isabella Chen felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The New Alliance. 3 months after the attack on Shadowmere Castle, Isabella Chen stood in the penthouse office of the Blackthorn Tower in downtown Seattle, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and crimson. The view from the 42nd floor was spectacular, but it wasn't the scenery that held her attention. It was the way the early morning light no longer hurt her eyes, the way she could see individual faces in the crowds of people 40 floors below, the way her reflection in the window showed subtle changes that marked her transformation from purely human to something more complex. The silver dagger that had changed her life rested in a specially designed holster at her side, its power dormant but always present, like a second heartbeat synchronized with her own. Over the past 3 months, she had learned to channel its abilities with increasing precision, though Lydia insisted she was still decades away from true mastery. Behind her, the office hummed with activity as the supernatural community's new financial command center prepared for another day of operations. The room was a blend of cutting-edge technology and ancient mysticism. Computer terminals displaying real-time market data sat next to crystal spheres that monitored magical energy fluctuations, while holographic displays of global financial networks shared space with scrying mirrors that showed supernatural activities across multiple dimensions. "The Tokyo markets are responding well to our new investment strategy," reported Marcus Thorne, very much alive despite the fictional reports of his death. The vampire had proven to be a brilliant financial strategist with an intuitive understanding of how market psychology worked across different supernatural communities. The dragon clans are particularly impressed with the returns on their precious metal portfolios. Working with dragon economics had been one of the more challenging aspects of her new role. Dragons didn't think about money the way humans or even other supernatural beings did. For them, wealth was literally a form of sustenance, and their investment strategies reflected dietary preferences that spanned millennia. "What about the werewolf pack territories?" she asked. "Any progress on the land acquisition disputes?" Sarah Moonwhisper looked up from her station where she was coordinating with supernatural real estate agents across 3 time zones. The witch's abilities to see probability streams and potential futures made her invaluable for predicting property values and identifying investment opportunities. "The Montana PAC has agreed to the territorial expansion, but they want guarantees that the new lands will be protected from human development for at least 50 years. Something that looks legitimate to human authorities but provides the long-term protection they need?" "Already working on it," Sarah confirmed with a smile. "I should have the legal framework ready by tomorrow." Isabella marveled at how quickly she'd adapted to conversations about werewolf territorial needs and dragon dietary investments. 3 months ago, her biggest challenge had been tracking down human embezzlers who stole millions of dollars. Now she was coordinating financial strategies for beings who measured their wealth in centuries and thought of national economies as temporary fluctuations. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and she felt the familiar flutter of attraction as Alexander emerged from his private office. Even after 3 months of working closely with him, the Vampire King's presence still affected her in ways she was still learning to understand. Part of it was his supernatural charisma, the natural magnetism that all-powerful vampires possessed. But there was something else too. A connection that had formed during their shared battles and the trust he'd shown by bringing her into his innermost circle. "The council meeting is set for this evening," Alexander announced. "Representatives from all major supernatural communities will be attending, either in person or through mystical projection." Isabella felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. The Supernatural Council was a governing body that few humans had ever seen, let alone participated. It included the leaders of vampire courts, werewolf pack alphas, witch covens, fae nobles, and other beings of power from across North America. They were gathering to discuss the ongoing threat posed by Dr. Vasquez and her allies, but Isabella knew they would also be evaluating her, the human who had claimed the power of the Night Court and positioned herself as a bridge between the mortal and supernatural worlds. "Are you ready for this?" Lydia asked, appearing beside Isabella with her usual silent grace. The ancient being looked concerned, which was unusual for someone who had lived through countless crises over the centuries. "As ready as anyone can be for a meeting with creatures out of mythology," Isabella replied. "I've read all the briefing materials, studied the political dynamics, and memorized the protocols for addressing different types of supernatural beings without accidentally starting a war." "That's not what I meant," Lydia said quietly. "I meant, are you ready for them to judge whether you're worthy of the power you've claimed? Because that's what tonight is really about." Isabella looked down at the silver dagger at her side. Over the past 3 months, she had learned that the Night Court's power came with responsibilities that extended far beyond financial management. She was now bound to protect both human and supernatural communities from primordial threats, to serve as a neutral arbiter in disputes between different species, and to maintain the ancient compacts that kept the supernatural world hidden from human authorities. It was a burden that had literally driven some previous Night Court champions insane. The knowledge that flowed through the silver dagger included memories of men and women who had started as idealistic protectors and ended as bitter, isolated guardians who saw all relationships as temporary and all causes as futile. "I think I'm ready," Isabella said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. "But I guess we'll find out tonight." Alexander moved closer, and Isabella caught his scent, something like winter air and old books, with an underlying note of danger that never quite went away. "You've proven yourself 3 times over," he said quietly. The financial networks you've designed are more secure than anything we've had in centuries. Your investigation techniques have uncovered corruption that we missed for decades, and your mastery of the Night Court's power grows stronger every day." "What?" Isabella asked, hearing the unspoken qualification in his tone. "But some of the council members are concerned about having a human, even a transformed human, in a position of such influence," Alexander admitted. "There are those who believe the supernatural world should remain completely separate from mortal affairs." She had expected this resistance. Despite the fact that supernatural beings had been secretly integrated with human civilization for centuries, there was still a strong isolationist faction that viewed any human involvement as contamination. "Who's leading the opposition?" she asked. "Elena Nightwhisper, Sarah's grandmother and the current head of the North American Witch Council," Lydia replied. "She's arguing that the Night Court's power should only be wielded by someone born to the supernatural world." Isabella felt a pang of disappointment. She had hoped that Sarah's support would extend to her family, but apparently bloodline politics were more complex than she'd realized. "There's also Lord Thornwood of the Winter Court," Alexander continued. "He's concerned that your human connections make you a security risk. The FBI is still looking for you, and he's worried that your former colleagues might be able to track you to us." That was a valid concern, Isabella had to admit. She had disappeared from her old life without explanation, leaving behind an apartment, a job, and colleagues who had no way of understanding what had happened to her. The FBI's missing person investigation was still active, though Alexander's people had managed to feed them false leads that suggested she had fled the country to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. "And then there's the Dragon Council," Lydia added with a grimace. "They're not opposed to you personally, but they're questioning whether the Night Court's power is real, or just an elaborate con game designed to increase vampire influence over supernatural politics." Isabella laughed despite her nervousness. "Well, I suppose I can't blame them for being skeptical. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be wielding ancient magical powers and mediating disputes between vampires and werewolves, I'd have recommended them for psychiatric evaluation. The thing is," Alexander said, his expression growing serious, "tonight isn't just about whether the council accepts you. Dr. Vasquez has been building alliances of her own over the past 3 months. We've identified at least 7 primordial entities that have agreed to support her campaign against the supernatural community." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. One primordial entity had been almost impossible to handle, even with the Night Court's power backing her up. 7 of them working together could potentially destroy both human and supernatural civilizations.
"What kind of timeline are we looking at?" she asked.
"Our intelligence suggests they're planning something for the autumn equinox," Lydia replied. "It's a time when the barriers between different realms are naturally weakened, which would give them access to powers and allies that are normally beyond reach." 6 months to prepare, Isabella mused. That's not much time to build defenses against entities that have existed since before human civilization. "Which is why tonight's meeting is so critical," Alexander said. "We need the Council to authorize a full alliance between all supernatural communities with shared resources and coordinated defense strategies. But some members are still more concerned with protecting their own territories than facing the larger threat." Isabella understood the political dynamics all too well. She had seen similar problems in human organizations, departments that refused to share information, agencies that competed for resources instead of cooperating against common threats, leaders who prioritized their own power over the mission they were supposed to serve. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Be yourself," Alexander said simply. "Show them that you understand both worlds, that you can protect supernatural interests without sacrificing human welfare. Some of them will test you, try to provoke you into showing favoritism or losing your temper. Don't let them succeed. And remember," Lydia added, "you're not asking for their approval. The Night Court's authority comes from compacts that predate most of their organizations. You are offering to work with them, not seeking permission to exist." Isabella nodded, filing away the distinction. It was important not to appear weak or deferential, especially when dealing with beings who had spent centuries or millennia in positions of absolute power within their own communities. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Isabella reviewed files on each council member, studied the political relationships between different supernatural factions, and practiced diplomatic responses to various scenarios that might arise during the meeting. She also spent time in the building's specially designed training room, working with the silver dagger to make sure her control over its power was as precise as possible. As evening approached, she changed into formal attire that Lydia had selected. A black suit tailored to accommodate the silver dagger with accessories that included protective amulets disguised as jewelry and fabric woven with threads that would help her resist magical influence. The overall effect was professional yet subtly supernatural, marking her as someone who belonged in both worlds. The council meeting was being held in the Shadowlands, a mystical realm that existed parallel to the physical world but was accessible only to supernatural beings and those they chose to bring with them. Alexander explained that it was neutral territory maintained by ancient magic and protected by wards that prevented violence or deception within its boundaries. The transition from the physical world to the Shadowlands was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. One moment she was standing in the Blackthorn Tower's conference room, holding Alexander's hand as he activated a transportation circle carved into the marble floor. The next moment, reality seemed to fold in on itself, colors inverting and sounds becoming crystalline echoes, before reforming into a vast amphitheater that looked like it had been carved from a single massive geode. The walls of the amphitheater were lined with crystals that pulsed with soft, multicolored light, providing illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air smelled of ozone and wild flowers, with an underlying current of power that made Isabella's skin tingle. The silver dagger at her side hummed in response to the ambient magic, its power resonating with the ancient energies that maintained this space. Council members were already taking their seats, or in some cases their designated spaces, since not all of them had physical forms that fit conventional furniture. Isabella recognized some of them from her briefings. Elena Nightwhisper sat with the other witch representatives, her silver hair gleaming in the crystal light and her expression carefully neutral. Lord Thornwood of the Winter Court had manifested as a figure of living ice and shadow, beautiful and terrible at the same time. The Dragon Council was represented by 3 ancient beings in human form, though the air around them shimmered with barely contained power. Alexander led Isabella to a section reserved for Vampire Court leadership, but she noticed that her own chair had been placed slightly apart from the others, a subtle indication that she was expected to represent her own interests rather than simply supporting the vampire position. As the meeting began, Isabella found herself impressed by the complexity of supernatural politics. Each representative had their own agenda, their own concerns, their own priorities. The werewolf pack leaders wanted guarantees that their territorial rights would be respected in any alliance structure. The witch covens demanded equal representation in decision-making processes. The Fey nobles insisted that any agreements must be written in language precise enough to prevent misinterpretation or exploitation. But underlying all the political maneuvering was a genuine fear of what Dr. Vasquez and her allies might be capable of. These were beings who had survived for centuries or millennia, who had faced threats that would drive humans insane with terror, yet they were all worried about the primordial entities gathering against them. "The question before us," announced Counselor Ashwood, an ancient vampire who served as the meeting's moderator, "is whether we can set aside our individual interests long enough to face a threat to all our communities." Elena Nightwhisper rose to speak, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led her coven for over 2 centuries. "Before we discuss alliance structures, we need to address the elephant in the room." Her gaze fixed on Isabella. "We have a human claiming to wield the power of the Night Court, asking us to trust her with information and authority that could destroy us all if misused." She stood, feeling the weight of dozens of supernatural gazes upon her, and drew the silver dagger from its holster. The weapon began glowing immediately, responding to the ambient magic of the Shadowlands and the presence of so many powerful beings. "I understand your concerns, Counselor Nightwhisper," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater. "You're being asked to trust someone who 3 months ago didn't even know your world existed. someone whose species has historically been both predator and prey to yours. She held up the glowing dagger, letting its light reflect off the crystal walls. But the Night Court's power doesn't lie. It can't be claimed by someone with impure motives or divided loyalties. The fact that I can wield this weapon at all is proof that I'm committed to protecting both human and supernatural communities. Weapons can be stolen, Lord Thornwood interjected, his voice like wind through winter trees. Power can be taken by force or deception. How do we know you didn't acquire that dagger through methods that would horrify us if we knew the truth? Isabella smiled, recognizing the test for what it was. Because the dagger itself will tell you. She reversed her grip on the weapon and offered its hilt to Elena Nightwhisper. The Night Court's blades were forged with truth magic. Anyone who touches one will see the true intentions of its wielder. If I acquired this power through evil means, if I'm planning to betray your trust, you'll know the moment you make contact with it. A murmur ran through the assembled council members. Truth magic was one of the most dangerous and reliable forms of supernatural investigation, but it required tremendous trust between the participants. If Isabella was hiding something, the experience could be psychologically devastating for both her and whoever touched the blade. Elena Nightwhisper studied Isabella for a long moment, then stepped forward and grasped the dagger's hilt. The effect was immediate and visible to everyone in the amphitheater. Light exploded from the weapon, but instead of the harsh glare Isabella had expected, it was warm and golden, filling the space with images that played out like three-dimensional movies in the air above them. They saw Isabella's recruitment to the FBI, her genuine dedication to justice, and her frustration with cases that didn't make sense. They saw her arrival at Shadowmere Castle, her shock at discovering the supernatural world, her decision to help despite the danger to herself. They saw her battle with Dr. Vasquez, her claim of the Night Court's power, and her efforts over the past 3 months to build bridges between different communities. But most importantly, they saw her true motivations, not just a desire to belong to something greater than herself, but a genuine commitment to protecting both human and supernatural beings from threats that neither could face alone. When the light faded, Elena Nightwhisper was staring at Isabella with an expression of amazement. "She's telling the truth," the witch announced to the council, "not just about her past, but about her intentions. She really does want to protect both worlds." Lord Thornwood's icy form shifted, becoming slightly less threatening. "The Night Court's judgment is not easily fooled," he admitted. "If the blade accepts her, then perhaps we should as well." Isabella felt a wave of relief as she took the dagger back from Elena. The truth magic had been more invasive than she'd expected. For a few moments, every secret, every fear, every doubt she'd ever had was laid bare for examination. But the ordeal had apparently convinced the council of her sincerity. "So we're all agreed that Miss Chen is trustworthy," said Councillor Ashwood. "The question now is whether we're willing to work together to face the primordial threat." What followed was several hours of complex negotiations as different factions worked out the details of an unprecedented alliance. There were disputes over command structures, resource allocation, information-sharing protocols, and territorial boundaries. But gradually a framework emerged that addressed most of the major concerns. The supernatural communities would pool their resources to create a joint defense force, with specialized units trained to fight primordial entities. Intelligence networks would be integrated to provide early warning of threats. Financial resources would be coordinated to ensure that no community was bankrupted by the costs of preparation. And Isabella, as the Night Court's champion, would serve as a neutral coordinator between different species, helping to resolve disputes and maintain the alliance's cohesion. By the time the meeting concluded, it was nearly dawn in the physical world. The council members began departing through various mystical portals, each returning to their own territories to begin implementing the agreements they had reached. Elena Nightwhisper was one of the last to leave. She approached Isabella with an expression that was both apologetic and respectful. "I owe you an apology," the witch said. "My concerns about your humanity blinded me to your actual character. Sarah speaks very highly of you, and now I understand why. No apology needed, Isabella replied. You are protecting your people, which is exactly what a good leader should do. I would have been suspicious too, in your position. Elena smiled, and Isabella could see the family resemblance to her granddaughter. You're going to need allies in the days to come. The primordial entities won't be impressed by council agreements or political alliances. They'll try to divide us, turn us against each other. When that happens, you can count on the witch's support. As the Shadowlands emptied, Isabella found herself alone with Alexander and Lydia. The crystal amphitheater seemed much larger without the crowd of supernatural beings, and the silence was almost oppressive after hours of political debate. How do you feel? Alexander asked. Isabella considered the question. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained by the intensity of the truth magic and the weight of the responsibilities she had accepted. But she was also exhilarated by what they had accomplished. Like we actually have a chance, she said. 3 months ago, Dr. Vasquez nearly destroyed your entire operation by herself. Now we have the resources of every major supernatural community working together to stop her and her allies. Don't get overconfident, Lydia warned. Primordial entities have been manipulating civilization since before recorded history. They know how to exploit weaknesses, how to turn strength into vulnerability. The fact that we're working together might actually make us easier targets in some ways. Isabella nodded, understanding the concern. Large organizations were often more vulnerable to infiltration and internal conflict than small, tight-knit groups, but they were also more resilient, better able to absorb losses and adapt to changing circumstances. We'll have to be careful, she agreed, but at least now we're not facing this threat alone. As they prepared to return to the physical world, Isabella took one last look around the crystal amphitheater. 6 months ago, she had been investigating routine financial crimes for the FBI, her biggest concern being whether she'd make her case quotas for the year. Now she was coordinating supernatural defense strategies and preparing to face entities that could reshape reality itself. Does